My ex-MIL destroyed my honeymoon and exposed my husband's shocking secrets. You won't believe the ending. Hi, my name is Emma. I'm 29 years old, and I live in a quiet little town just outside of Portland. At least, I thought it was quiet until my ex-MIL, Judith, decided to bring a whirlwind of chaos to my doorstep on my wedding day of all days. For context, I had been engaged once before. That relationship ended 3 years ago in what could only be described as a complete disaster. My ex-fiancé, Daniel, was the kind of guy who looked perfect on the outside. Charming smile, well-spoken, and with a knack for making everyone around him feel like they were the center of the universe. But behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative, and emotionally exhausting. Daniel's mother, Judith, was his biggest enabler. She'd call me constantly, checking in on her precious boy, as though I was his live-in nanny and not his partner. She'd send me unsolicited advice on everything from what to cook for him to how to keep him happy. It was suffocating. Leaving Daniel wasn't easy. He cried, begged, and promised to change, but I knew better. I packed my things, blocked their numbers, and moved on with my life. Fast forward to today, where I'm happier than I ever thought I could be. My fiancé, Mark, is everything Daniel wasn't: kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in building a life together. The morning of my wedding started out perfect. The sun was shining, my dress fit like a dream, and my bridesmaids were buzzing around, making sure everything was on schedule. I was just about to step into the car that would take us to the venue when a loud knock at the door jolted us all. "Are we expecting anyone?" my maid of honor, Sarah, asked, peering through the window. "No," I said, already feeling a pit forming in my stomach. I walked to the door, still in my robe, and pulled it open. And there she was, Judith. She stood on my porch in a beige pantsuit, clutching her purse like it was a weapon. Her hair was styled to perfection, but her eyes were sharp and angry. "Emma," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We need to talk." I stared at her, speechless. This had to be a joke, right? I hadn't seen or spoken to this woman in years, and now she shows up uninvited on the most important day of my life? "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Judith," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, we do," she said, stepping forward as if she had every right to be there. "This is about closure. For Daniel." Closure? For Daniel? The man who had cheated on me, lied to me, and gaslit me into questioning my own sanity? I felt my blood boil. "Judith, this is my wedding day," I said, crossing my arms. "You need to leave." But she didn't budge. Instead, she launched into a tirade about how Daniel was heartbroken, how he couldn't move on because I had abandoned him, and how I owed him an explanation. "I owe him nothing," I snapped. "He tormented me for years, Judith. If he's still hung up on me, that's his problem, not mine." At this point, Sarah had joined me at the door, her arms crossed and her face a mask of annoyance. "You heard her," Sarah said. "Leave. Now." But Judith wasn't finished. "Do you think this marriage will last?" she sneered, her voice turning cold. "Do you really think you'll be happy with someone like him?" That was it. I was done. "You need to leave, or I'm calling the police," I said, slamming the door in her face. My hands were shaking as I turned to Sarah, who was already dialing Mark. "Mark," she said into the phone, "you need to know what's going on." As we drove to the venue, I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. Was this a warning sign? A test? Or just Judith being the unhinged person she always was? Either way, I knew this wasn't the end of it. And I was right. The ceremony was beautiful. For a moment, I forgot about Judith and her ridiculous outburst. I was marrying the love of my life, surrounded by friends and family, and nothing else mattered. But as we stepped out for photos, I saw her again. This time lurking near the entrance to the reception hall. "What the hell is she doing here?" Mark whispered, his jaw clenched. "I don't know," I said, my stomach churning. Before we could act, Judith made her move. She walked straight into the hall, past the staff, and grabbed the mic meant for the DJ. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice echoing through the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to say something." Every head turned toward her, and the room fell silent. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. Judith had officially crossed the line. But before I could stop her, she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. I just want everyone to know the truth about Emma, about who she really is. The silence in the reception hall was deafening. All eyes were on Judith, who stood at the front of the room clutching the microphone like she was delivering a TED Talk on ruining lives. My stomach dropped, and my hands curled into fists at my sides. Emma might look like the perfect bride today, Judith began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. But she's not the person you all think she is. You see, my son, Daniel, was supposed to be the man standing beside her today. Gasps rippled through the room, and my heart pounded in my chest. I glanced at Mark, who looked as if he might charge toward her at any second. I grabbed his arm, silently pleading with him to let me handle it. Judith, I said loudly, stepping forward. My voice was firm, but my legs felt like jelly. That's enough. You need to leave. She ignored me, raising her voice to drown mine out. Emma broke my son's heart. She left him with no explanation, no chance to make things right. And now, here she is, acting like she's some innocent victim. The guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do. My parents looked mortified, and Sarah, my maid of honor, was already on the phone, likely calling security. I marched toward Judith, my heels clicking against the floor, every ounce of rage I had bottled up over the years bubbling to the surface. You don't get to come here and ruin my wedding day, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Daniel and I ended things because he was toxic, manipulative, and cheated on me, and you enabled him every step of the way. Judith's face twisted in indignation. That's not true, she snapped. Daniel loved you. He made mistakes, sure, but you were never willing to forgive him. And now you're marrying this stranger. Mark took a step forward, his jaw tight. I think that's enough, he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. You need to leave before we have you escorted out. Escorted out? Judith scoffed, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. I have every right to be here. I'm just trying to protect my son from this. Stop it, I shouted, cutting her off. The room fell silent again, and my voice echoed off the walls. You're not protecting anyone, Judith. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing Daniel. And you're making it crystal clear why I had to cut you both out of my life. Judith's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For a moment, I thought I had finally gotten through to her. But then, she took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and said, Fine. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But don't say I didn't warn you when this marriage falls apart just like the last one. Before I could respond, 2 security guards appeared at the entrance, summoned by Sarah's call. They walked briskly toward Judith, who, to my surprise, didn't resist. She handed the microphone to one of them and shot me a glare that sent a chill down my spine. You'll regret this, she hissed as they led her out. The second she was out of sight, the tension in the room broke. Conversations buzzed to life, and a few guests nervously laughed, unsure of how to react. My dad was at my side in an instant, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Are you okay, sweetheart? He asked, concern etched on his face. I'm fine, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Mark wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. Do you want to take a minute? He asked softly. I shook my head. No, let's just move on. I'm not letting her ruin this day for us. The DJ, bless his heart, took over the microphone and made a joke about unexpected guests, which earned a few chuckles. Slowly, the room returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Judith's little stunt wasn't the end of it. Something about the way she had said, "You'll regret this," sent shivers down my spine. The rest of the evening went off without a hitch, or so I thought. It wasn't until Mark and I returned to our hotel suite that I noticed something was off. There was an envelope waiting for us at the front desk, addressed to me in elegant cursive handwriting. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. Mark frowned, watching me closely. What is it? I don't know, I said, carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short, cryptic message. You think it's over? It's not. J. My heart raced as I handed the note to Mark. He read it, his brow furrowing. "Judith," he muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "But how did she know where we were staying?" I whispered, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Mark placed the note on the table and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the hotel manager. We need to figure out how this happened." As he spoke to the staff, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was only the beginning. Judith's words from earlier echoed in my mind. "You'll regret this." And for the first time since the wedding, I wondered if she was right. The next morning, Mark and I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains and an unsettling sense of unease still hanging over us. We had planned to leave for our honeymoon that afternoon, 2 blissful weeks in Hawaii. But Judith's note lingered like a storm cloud over what should have been the happiest time of our lives. "I checked with the hotel manager," Mark said as we packed our bags. "They said the envelope was left by a delivery service. No name, no ID, nothing." "Of course," I muttered, folding one of my dresses and shoving it into the suitcase. "She's nothing if not sneaky." Mark stopped and put his hands on my shoulders. "Hey, we're not going to let her ruin this. We'll deal with whatever this is when we get back. For now, let's just focus on us, okay?" I nodded, but deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Judith wasn't done yet. We arrived at the airport without any issues, checked in, and made it through security smoothly. I started to relax, thinking maybe Judith had finally given up. But as we waited at the gate, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unfamiliar address, with the subject line, "You can't ignore the truth forever." My stomach churned as I opened it. The message was short and cryptic. "You don't know him like I do. Be careful, Jay." "What is it?" Mark asked, noticing the change in my expression. I handed him my phone, and he read the email, his jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice low and controlled. "She's trying to get in your head. Don't let her." I nodded, but my hands were shaking as I slipped the phone back into my purse. The flight couldn't come fast enough. The first few days in Hawaii were like a dream. We stayed at a gorgeous resort on the beach, ate incredible food, and spent our days exploring the island. For a while, I managed to forget about Judith and her threats. But on the 4th day, the dream started to unravel. Mark and I were lounging by the pool when my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. "Ask him about Las Vegas." "Jay." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. What was she talking about? I hadn't been to Las Vegas, and as far as I knew, neither had Mark. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing my tense expression. I hesitated, then handed him the phone. "What does this mean?" I asked. Mark read the message, his brow furrowing. "Las Vegas? I have no idea." "You've never been there?" "Not since college," he said, looking genuinely confused. "Why would she bring that up?" I shrugged, but the pit in my stomach grew deeper. That evening, we decided to have dinner at one of the resort's fancier restaurants. I was determined not to let Judith's mind games ruin our honeymoon. But as we were being seated, I spotted a familiar face at the bar. Judith. She was sitting there, sipping a martini like she had every right to be there. My blood ran cold. What the hell is she doing here? I whispered to Mark. He followed my gaze, his face darkening. "That's it. This ends now." Mark stormed over to her, and I followed, my heart racing. Judith turned to us, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Well, isn't this a lovely surprise?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "How did you know we were here?" Mark demanded, his voice low and furious. Judith took a sip of her drink, clearly enjoying herself. "Oh, I have my ways," she said cryptically. "This is harassment," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to leave us alone." Judith raised an eyebrow. "I'm just here on vacation. It's not my fault we happen to be at the same resort." "Bullshit," Mark snapped. "You're stalking us." Judith's smile faded, and her eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Mark," she said, her voice cold and venomous. "Emma isn't who you think she is." "Enough," I said, my voice rising. "You've crossed every line imaginable, and I'm done playing your games. If you don't leave us alone, I'll get the police involved. Judith stood, towering over me. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice low and threatening. But don't worry. You'll see soon enough. She brushed past us and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me shaking with anger and fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of Judith's cryptic warnings. What did she mean by Las Vegas? And why was she so determined to ruin my life? As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed again. Another email. This one had an attachment. The subject line read, "Proof." My hands trembled as I opened the email. The message was short. "I told you to ask him, but here's what you need to know." I opened the attachment and froze. It was a series of photos, grainy, but clear enough to see the subjects. One of them was unmistakably Mark. He was sitting at a bar with a woman I didn't recognize, their heads close together, laughing. Another photo showed them leaving together, hand in hand. The timestamp on the photos? 2 years ago. I stared at the screen, my heart shattering into a million pieces. This couldn't be real. Mark wasn't like this. He wasn't Daniel. But as I turned to look at him sleeping peacefully beside me, doubt crept in. What else didn't I know about the man I had just married? I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed those photos over and over again, each one feeling like a dagger in my chest. I kept telling myself it had to be fake, that Judith had doctored them to manipulate me, but the timestamp gnawed at me. 2 years ago, Mark and I had already been dating. Morning light filtered through the curtains as Mark stirred beside me. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in the photos with the man I thought I knew. "Good morning," he said groggily, leaning over to kiss my forehead. I pulled away. "We need to talk." His brows knitted together. "What's wrong?" I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, pulled up the email, and shoved it toward him. "Explain this." Mark squinted at the screen, his confusion quickly shifting to shock. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter," I snapped. "Is it real?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Emma, it's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, great. That's exactly what someone says when it's exactly what it looks like. Who is she, Mark?" He set the phone down and reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Her name is Melissa," he said reluctantly. "She's someone I knew from work." "Knew from work?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You were holding her hand, Mark. That doesn't scream, just colleagues." Mark sighed. "It was a mistake, okay? I had a few drinks, and she was going through a rough time. We talked and things got a little too friendly." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Did you sleep with her?" "No," he said quickly, his eyes wide. "I swear, Emma, it never went that far." I realized what I was doing was wrong and ended it before it crossed any more lines. I wanted to believe him, desperately, but the photos, Judith's cryptic warnings, and Mark's hesitation all painted a different picture. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "We were together, Mark. I deserve to know." He dropped his head into his hands. "Because I was ashamed. I didn't want to hurt you. And it was over before it really began." Tears blurred my vision. "You should have told me," I whispered. Mark reached for me again, his expression pleading. "Emma, please. I love you. What happened back then doesn't change that. Judith is trying to destroy us. Don't let her win." I wanted to forgive him, to let this be a bump in the road, not a wall we couldn't climb. But trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The rest of the day was a blur. Mark tried to distract me with activities, snorkeling, sightseeing, a sunset dinner cruise, but the photos and his confession stayed at the forefront of my mind. As we returned to our room that evening, I noticed something strange. The door to our suite was slightly ajar. "Did you leave it open?" I asked, my voice tight. Mark shook his head, his body tense as he pushed the door open cautiously. Inside, the room was in chaos. Our suitcases had been rifled through, clothes and personal items scattered everywhere. On the bed sat a single envelope, propped up like a centerpiece. Mark grabbed it and tore it open, revealing a single piece of paper. "You think this is bad? You haven't seen anything yet." My knees buckled, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head spinning. "This has gone too far," Mark said, his voice shaking with anger. "We're calling the police." The resort's security team arrived first, followed by local law enforcement. They took statements, examined the room, and promised to investigate. But there wasn't much they could do. "No cameras in the hallways," one officer explained. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing." As we tried to piece together what had happened, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You can't protect her forever. She deserves the truth." Mark clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. "That's it," he said, his voice low and furious. "We're cutting the honeymoon short. We're going home." I didn't argue. As much as I wanted to stay and salvage what was left of our trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that Judith was just getting started. The flight home was tense and silent. Mark spent most of it on his laptop, likely trying to figure out how Judith had managed to track us down. I stared out the window, lost in thought. When we finally landed, I was relieved to be back on familiar ground. But my relief was short-lived. As we pulled into the driveway of our house, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar, just like our hotel room. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice firm. He got out of the car and approached the house cautiously. I watched as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Moments later, he came back out, his face pale. "She was here," he said, his voice hollow. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping out of the car. Mark held up a piece of paper, identical to the one left in our hotel room. "Welcome home, Jay." We stood there on the front lawn, staring at the note like it was a ticking bomb. Mark's jaw tightened, and I could feel the heat of his frustration radiating off him. My chest felt heavy as dread pooled in my stomach. Judith had made it clear she wasn't going to stop. "I'm done," Mark growled, crumpling the note in his fist. "This ends tonight." Before I could stop him, he marched into the house, his movements sharp and determined. "Mark," I called, running after him. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt charged, like a storm was brewing. Mark went straight for the kitchen, grabbed his phone, and began dialing. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "The police," he said, his tone clipped. "If she broke in, there's evidence, and they're going to find it." But before he could hit call, the doorbell rang. We both froze. Mark's eyes met mine, and I could see the same thought flashing through his mind. Judith. Slowly, he walked to the door, his steps heavy. I followed closely, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Mark swung the door open, and there she was. Judith. She stood on the porch, her face calm and composed, as if she hadn't been tormenting us for weeks. She was holding a folder, thick and bulging with papers. "Can I come in?" she asked, her tone almost casual. "No," Mark snapped. "You're trespassing. Leave before I call the cops." Judith tilted her head, unfazed by his anger. "If you want the truth, you'll let me in. Otherwise, you'll never see this," she said, lifting the folder slightly. "What is that?" I demanded, stepping beside Mark. She looked at me, her eyes piercing. "The truth about your husband." Against my better judgment, we let her in. Mark stood by the door, arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched into fists. Judith placed the folder on the coffee table and took a seat across from me, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "This ends tonight," I said, my voice firm. "Say what you need to say, and then leave us alone." Judith opened the folder and began spreading out its contents. Photos, printed emails, bank statements. There was no rhyme or reason to the chaos she laid before us. "Mark's been keeping secrets," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You think you know him, Emma, but you don't." "This is ridiculous," Mark said, stepping forward. "I told you, everything with Melissa was a mistake, and it's over. You're just trying to ruin us." Judith smirked. Melissa was just the tip of the iceberg. She slid a photo toward me. It showed Mark with another woman, this one unfamiliar. They were sitting in a car, their heads close together. The timestamp was from a year ago, right in the middle of our engagement. My stomach turned. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her name is Rachel, Judith said. She works at his office. I turned to Mark, my eyes blazing. Is this true? Mark looked at the photo, his face unreadable. I can explain, he said finally. Of course you can, Judith sneered. You always can. What followed was an hour of revelations that left me reeling. Mark admitted to meeting Rachel for drinks a few times, though he swore it was innocent. He denied anything physical happened, but the evidence Judith presented painted a murkier picture. Emails between them hinted at something deeper, something he hadn't told me. You're a liar, I said, tears streaming down my face. How could you do this to me? Mark reached for me, but I backed away. Emma, please, he said. I love you. None of this means anything. You mean everything to me. Judith leaned back, watching the chaos unfold with satisfaction. See? I told you. He's not the man you think he is. That was when something snapped inside me. You're no saint either, I said, turning to Judith. You've been stalking us, breaking into our home, trying to destroy our lives. Why? What do you get out of this? Judith's smile faltered for the first time. You don't understand, she said. I'm trying to protect you. Protect me? I laughed bitterly. From what? From someone who made mistakes? You've crossed every line imaginable, Judith. This isn't protection, it's obsession. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. Get out of my house. Now. Judith hesitated, clearly not expecting me to stand up to her. But after a tense moment, she gathered her folder and left without another word. Mark and I were left alone in the wreckage of our marriage. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. Mark nodded, his shoulders slumping. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Emma. I swear. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. Mark had left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter apologizing again and promising to make things right. But as I sat there with my coffee, something about Judith's words nagged at me. She had been unhinged, yes, but there was a kernel of truth in her accusations. I opened my laptop and began digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Emails, financial records, social media posts. Judith hadn't been lying about everything. Mark had a pattern of secrecy, of half-truths and hidden connections. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A hotel reservation. 2 weeks ago. The same weekend I had been out of town visiting my sister. The name listed alongside his? Rachel. Mark came home that evening to find me waiting for him, his bags packed and sitting by the door. Emma, he began, but I held up a hand. Save it, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I found the reservation. I found her. His face crumbled, and I knew, without him saying a word, that it was true. You need to leave, I said, my voice breaking. He tried to argue, but I wouldn't budge. Finally, he gathered his things and left, leaving me alone in the silence. As I sat there, staring at the empty house, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Judith had been right about one thing. I didn't know Mark as well as I thought I did, but she had been wrong about something else. I wasn't a victim. I was stronger than she, or Mark, had given me credit for. And as I locked the door behind him, I knew one thing for certain. I was done letting other people control my life. This was my fresh start.